Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cottonwood leaves, casting dappled shadows across the surface of Driftwood Creek. Thomas Morgan sat on the weathered stump that had become his thinking spot over the past 3 weeks. He watched as golden light spilled over the water, transforming ordinary ripples into ribbons of molten amber. At 46, Thomas had the sturdy build of a man accustomed to physical labor, though grief had carved hollow spaces beneath his cheekbones and added silver threads to his dark brown hair. His hands, calloused from years of working the land, rested on knees that ached more with each passing season. The small camp he'd established sat just 20 yards back from the creek bank, hidden among a stand of cottonwoods, whose massive trunks spoke of centuries weathered in this peaceful grove. A simple canvas tent, a fire ring lined with river stones, and a few personal belongings were all he'd brought on this journey that had no clear destination. 3 weeks ago, he'd packed what he could carry on his horse, left the homestead in the capable hands of his brother-in-law, and ridden west with no particular plan beyond escaping the crushing emptiness of a home that no longer held Margaret. Thomas closed his eyes and let the sounds of the creek wash over him, the gentle babble of water finding its path through smooth stones, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface, and the constant chorus of crickets beginning their evening song, formed a natural symphony that almost, but never quite, drowned out his thoughts. This spot along Driftwood Creek had become a refuge of sorts, a place where grief didn't press quite so heavily on his chest. He hadn't intended to stay more than a night when he'd first discovered the grove, but something about the place had coaxed him into lingering. Just a few more days, he murmured to himself, the words carried away by a breeze that set the cottonwood leaves shivering. Their trembling created a sound like gentle rainfall, though no clouds marred the clear blue expanse overhead. Thomas had said the same thing last week and the week before that. The truth was, he had nowhere pressing to be, no reason to continue his aimless wandering just yet. Here, at least, the relentless cycle of his thoughts seemed to slow. As the sun dipped lower toward the distant hills, Thomas stirred himself to attend to practical matters. He gathered fallen branches for his evening fire, refilled his canteen from the clear running waters of the creek, and checked on his horse, a dependable dun gelding named Samson who grazed contentedly in a grassy clearing nearby. These simple tasks anchored him to the present, preventing his mind from drifting too far into memories that still cut like freshly honed blades. With practiced efficiency, Thomas soon had a small fire crackling in the stone ring. He set a pot of coffee to boil and unwrapped the remains of a rabbit he'd snared the previous day. The familiar routines of wilderness survival had become a comfort, clear problems with straightforward solutions, unlike the bottomless void that Margaret's passing had left in his life. 6 months had passed since influenza had taken her, 6 months of a silence so profound it seemed to have substance. As twilight settled over the grove, bringing with it a deepening blue that filtered through the branches overhead, Thomas finished his simple meal and leaned back against the trunk of a massive cottonwood. The evening chorus of crickets intensified, punctuated occasionally by the melodic call of a whip-poor will from somewhere deeper in the woods. He nursed his cup of coffee, watching the fire's dancing flames and allowing his thoughts to wander. It was then, in that liminal space between day and night, that Thomas first heard it. The faint, almost imperceptible notes of a fiddle playing somewhere along the creek. The melody was hesitant at first, like the musician was warming up or perhaps deciding what to play. Then it found its rhythm, a slow, melancholic tune that seemed to weave itself into the natural sounds of the grove rather than disrupt them. Thomas set his coffee cup down carefully and rose to his feet, straining to identify the direction from which the music came. It seemed to float on the evening air, sometimes appearing to originate downstream, other times sounding as if it were coming from across the creek entirely. The tune itself was hauntingly familiar, reminiscent of something Margaret used to play on quiet evenings when the day's work was done. "Hello?" Thomas called, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the peaceful grove. "Is someone there?" The fiddle music continued uninterrupted, neither faltering nor growing louder at his call. Thomas grabbed his lantern, lit it from the fire, and began to move cautiously along the creek bank. The soft ground muffled his footsteps as he walked, scanning the gathering darkness for any sign of another person. The music remained elusive, seemingly always just ahead or behind, never quite where he expected it to be. After following the meandering path of the creek for nearly a quarter mile, Thomas paused. The twilight had deepened into true night, and even with his lantern, navigation became increasingly difficult through the thick undergrowth. The fiddle music continued, though, if anything, the melody had grown richer, more certain in its execution. There was something in the playing style, a particular way of lingering on certain notes, that reminded him painfully of Margaret. She had played just that way, with a natural talent that made even the simplest tunes sound profound. "Margaret played that song," Thomas said aloud, speaking to the unseen musician as if they might respond. "My wife. She's been gone 6 months now." The music continued unabated, neither acknowledging his words nor seeming to notice his presence at all. After a few more attempts to locate the source of the sound, Thomas reluctantly turned back toward his camp, the mysterious melody following him all the way. Only when he reached the clearing did the music begin to fade, growing fainter and fainter until it merged with the night sounds of the grove and disappeared altogether. Thomas sat by his fire long into the night, listening intently for any return of the ethereal fiddle. His mind sought rational explanations. Another traveler camped further along the creek, perhaps? Or even his own grief-addled imagination conjuring sounds from the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Yet the melody had been too precise, too intentional to be merely the product of nature or delusion. As he finally retired to his tent, Thomas found himself wondering if he might have wandered into one of those thin places Margaret had sometimes spoken of. Spots where the boundary between worlds grew permeable. Such fanciful thinking had never been his habit, but grief had a way of reshaping a man's mind, opening him to possibilities he might once have dismissed without consideration. The following morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the canopy of cottonwood leaves to dapple the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Thomas rose early, as was his custom, rekindled his fire, and brewed fresh coffee while considering the events of the previous evening. In the practical light of day, the mysterious fiddle music seemed more dream than reality, though he remained certain of what he'd heard. After a simple breakfast, Thomas decided to explore further along the creek, following the path he'd taken in pursuit of the music. Daylight revealed the area to be even more picturesque than he'd realized during his twilight search. The creek widened into shallow pools, where minnows darted among water plants and wildflowers bloomed in profusion along the banks. He saw no sign of another campsite or any indication that another person had recently passed this way. About a half-mile downstream from his camp, Thomas discovered a natural clearing where the cottonwoods formed an almost perfect circle around a patch of lush grass. At the center stood one enormous tree, its trunk wider than a man could encircle with both arms outstretched. Something about the clearing struck Thomas as deliberate, as if it had been shaped by human hands rather than forming naturally, though he could see no evidence of cultivation or management. "Mighty peculiar," he murmured, approaching the central tree with curiosity. Its bark was deeply furrowed, bearing marks and carvings that had been weathered by time to mere suggestions of their original forms. Near its base, half hidden by tall grass, Thomas spotted something that didn't belong among the natural detritus of the forest floor. Kneeling, he carefully retrieved a carved wooden tuning peg, the kind used on stringed instruments worn smooth from years of handling. The discovery sent a shiver down his spine despite the warmth of the morning sun. Someone had indeed played music here, though whether recently or long ago remained impossible to determine from this single artifact. "Found something interesting there, stranger?" The voice startled Thomas so badly he nearly fell backward. Turning quickly, he found himself facing an elderly man who had approached with remarkable stealth through the surrounding woods. The stranger was short and wiry, with a full white beard that reached nearly to his chest and deep-set eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore buckskins that had seen better days and carried a worn Winchester rifle cradled casually in one arm. "Didn't mean to give you a fright," the old man continued, a smile crinkling the web of wrinkles around his eyes. "Name's Harlan Weaver. Been trapping these parts for more years than I care to count." Thomas introduced himself as he rose to his feet, still holding the wooden tuning peg. "I found this just now," he explained, extending his hand to show the object. "Came looking because I heard fiddle music last night, down by the creek. Thought I might find whoever was playing." Something shifted in Harlan's expression. Not quite surprise, but a knowing look that suggested Thomas's experience wasn't unexpected. "So, you heard the fiddler," he said, nodding slowly. "Not everyone does. Some folks camp in this grove for weeks and never hear a note. Others catch it their first night." "You know about this?" Thomas asked, gesturing vaguely toward the clearing and the creek beyond. "About the music?" Harlan leaned his rifle carefully against the massive cottonwood and settled himself on a fallen log with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints protested sudden actions. "Been hearing that fiddle, on and off for nigh on 30 years, he confirmed. "First time nearly scared the life out of me. I was checking my trap lines just after sundown and suddenly there was music coming from nowhere and everywhere at once." Thomas sat down across from Harlan, his interest thoroughly piqued. "But who's playing? I walked quite a ways following the sound last night, but never could find the source." "You won't find him that way," Harlan said with quiet certainty. "Not by chasing after the sound. The fiddler comes and goes on his own terms, plays for his own reasons." The old trapper paused, studying Thomas with keen eyes that belied his advanced years. "Though I did see him once, only once, in all these years." "You saw him?" Thomas leaned forward eagerly. "Who is he?" Harlan's gaze turned distant, focusing on something invisible to Thomas. "It was about 15 years back, during a full moon in October. I was camped not far from here, and the fiddle started up just as the moon cleared the eastern ridge. But that night, instead of staying mysterious, the music led me straight to this very clearing." Thomas glanced around the circular space, seeing it differently now, not just as a natural formation, but as a stage of sorts for whatever strange performance Harlan had witnessed. Was standing right there, Harlan continued, pointing to a spot near the massive central tree. Young fella, couldn't have been more than 25, dressed old-fashioned like folks did back before the war, had his eyes closed, swaying slightly as he played, with moonlight pouring down all around him. Most peculiar thing was how the cottonwood leaves seemed to glow silver in that light, moving to the rhythm of his bow like they were dancing. But who was he? Thomas pressed. Did he speak to you? Harlan shook his head slowly. Never seemed to notice me at all. I stood at the edge of the clearing for what must have been an hour, just watching and listening. He played tunes I'd never heard before, and some that reminded me of songs from my youth. When the last song ended, he lowered his fiddle, gave a small bow like he was acknowledging applause I couldn't hear, and then the old man's voice trailed off. And then, Thomas prompted, and then he walked straight into that big cottonwood tree. Harlan finished simply. Didn't bump against it or climb it. Walked into it, like there was a door none but him could see. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. Under normal circumstances, Thomas might have dismissed such a tale as the fabrication of an eccentric old man, or perhaps the product of moonshine in isolation. But the memory of last night's music was still fresh in his mind, and the wooden peg he held seemed physical proof of something unusual in this peaceful grove. "Do you know anything about him?" Thomas asked. "His name, or why he might be here?" Harlan scratched thoughtfully at his beard. "There are stories, of course, always are about peculiar things in these parts. Some say he was a traveling musician who met his end in these woods during a violent storm. A cottonwood struck by lightning fell on him as he sought shelter. Others claim he was killed for his fine fiddle by bandits who couldn't play it themselves. My favorite tale, though, is that he fell in love with a local girl whose father forbade the match. They planned to elope, and he would signal her with his fiddle when it was time to flee together, but she never came, and he plays still, hoping she'll hear and find her way to him at last." The romantic notion stirred something in Thomas's heart, a resonance with his own sense of waiting for someone who would never come. "Which version do you believe?" he asked quietly. Harlan shrugged. "Don't much matter what I believe. The fiddle plays regardless, and the music brings its own kind of truth." He stood up, retrieving his rifle with practiced ease. "I've got traps to check. You staying in these parts for a spell?" Thomas nodded. "For a little while at least. Then you might hear him again," Harlan said, adjusting his battered hat. "If you're meant to." With that cryptic comment, the old trapper moved off into the woods, seeming to blend with the dappled shadows until he disappeared from view entirely. Thomas remained in the clearing for some time afterward, turning the wooden peg over in his hands and contemplating Harlan's stories. Eventually, he tucked the small item into his shirt pocket and made his way back to his campsite, his mind filled with images of a spectral fiddler playing beneath the cottonwoods. That evening, Thomas found himself watching the fading light with greater anticipation than he had felt for anything in the months since Margaret's passing. He prepared his supper early and positioned himself on the stump by the creek bank, determined to be ready should the mysterious music begin again. As twilight descended, bringing with it the first chorus of crickets and the gentle stirring of a breeze through the cottonwood leaves, Thomas waited with uncharacteristic patience. When the first notes finally came, they seemed to rise directly from the burbling waters of the creek, a simple, plaintive melody that might have been carried on the current itself. Thomas closed his eyes, allowing the music to wash over him. Tonight's tune was different from the previous evenings, more cheerful in its progression, reminiscent of dance music played at harvest celebrations and community gatherings. This time, instead of immediately setting off in search of the source, Thomas remained seated on his stump. Harlan's words returned to him, not by chasing after the sound. Perhaps the music wasn't meant to be pursued, but simply experienced. For nearly an hour, Thomas sat motionless as the invisible fiddler played one tune after another, each flowing seamlessly into the next. Some melodies he recognized from his younger days, while others seemed entirely new to his ears, yet somehow familiar to his heart. As the music continued, Thomas found himself thinking of Margaret, not with the sharp pain that usually accompanied memories of her, but with a gentler sense of appreciation for the life they had shared. He remembered how she would play her fiddle on their small porch as evening settled over their homestead, her slender fingers dancing across the strings, while fireflies rose from the surrounding field. Their neighbors had often commented that Margaret could coax emotions from wood and catgut that most people couldn't express with words. She would have loved this place, Thomas said aloud, his voice barely audible above the creek's constant murmur and the ethereal fiddle music. These old trees, the way the light plays on the water. She always did have an eye for beauty. As if in response to his words, the music shifted to a slower, more deliberate tune, one that Thomas recognized with a jolt that nearly stopped his heart. It was a song Margaret had composed herself, a melody she had played for him on their 10th anniversary. The fiddler performed it perfectly, capturing every nuance, every subtle variation that had made Margaret's playing so distinctive. "How can you know that song?" Thomas whispered, rising to his feet without conscious thought. "No one knows that song but me." The music continued undisturbed, the familiar melody winding its way through the darkening grove. Thomas found himself moving toward the sound, drawn not by curiosity now, but by an urgency he couldn't articulate. The tune was Margaret's, played exactly as she had played it, with all the particular flourishes that had been uniquely hers. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence flowed through the evening air with unmistakable clarity. Following the music led Thomas to the circular clearing he had discovered earlier that day. In the deepening twilight, the space appeared transformed. The central cottonwood now loomed like a sentinel, its massive trunk and spreading branches darkly silhouetted against the indigo sky. The grass seemed to glow with a subtle luminescence, though whether this was a trick of the fading light or something more unusual, Thomas couldn't determine. The fiddle music emanated from the clearing itself, though no musician was visible. Thomas stood at the edge of the circle, reluctant to enter what increasingly felt like sacred space. The melody that had been Margaret's own creation concluded, and after a brief pause, another familiar tune began. The simple lullaby she had played for their daughter, who had lived only 6 short months before, succumbing to fever many years ago. Tears sprang to Thomas's eyes unbidden. This was too specific, too personal to be coincidence or imagination. Someone, or something, was playing the soundtrack of his life with Margaret, recreating through music the most intimate moments they had shared. He sank to his knees at the edge of the clearing, overwhelmed by emotions he had been holding at bay for months through sheer force of will. "Is it you, Margaret?" he called, his voice breaking. "Have you found a way to reach me?" The music paused momentarily, a silence that seemed to hold its breath. Then, softer than before, the fiddle began a new melody, their wedding dance, the first tune they had swayed to as husband and wife 23 years earlier. Thomas remained kneeling as darkness completed its descent, the stars emerging overhead while the invisible fiddler played on, each song a chapter from the story of a love now separated by death's impenetrable barrier. Only when the moon rose, casting silver light through the cottonwood branches to create shifting patterns across the clearing, did the music finally fade. Thomas remained where he was for some time afterward, feeling both drained and somehow renewed. Whatever the explanation for what he had experienced, it had breached the wall of grief that had surrounded him since Margaret's passing, allowing emotions to flow freely for the first time in months. When he finally returned to his camp, Thomas felt a curious sense of peace, despite the intensity of what he had just experienced. He built up his fire, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat wrapped in his blanket, staring into the flames while turning possibilities over in his mind. Was it truly Margaret somehow reaching across the divide to comfort him? Was the spectral fiddler Harlan described somehow connected to his wife? Or was there a more mundane explanation that his grief-hungry heart simply refused to accept? "Doesn't much matter what I believe," he murmured, echoing Harlan's earlier sentiment. "The music brings its own kind of truth." Sleep came more easily to Thomas that night than it had in months. His dreams were filled with fiddle music and dancing cottonwood leaves beneath a silver moon, Margaret's laugh weaving through it all like a bright thread through a tapestry of sound. The next morning, Thomas woke to the sound of a child's laughter. A clear, bright sound that seemed out of place in his solitary camp. Emerging from his tent, he discovered a young girl of perhaps 10 or 11 years perched on his thinking stump, dangling her bare feet in the creek water. She wore a simple dress that had been patched in several places, and her dark hair hung in 2 neat braids. A leather satchel rested beside her, and she appeared to be sketching in a small book balanced on her knees. "Good morning," Thomas called, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "You're up and about early?" The girl looked up from her drawing without any sign of alarm. "Papa says the best light for seeing things proper is just after sunrise," she replied matter-of-factly. "Are you the man staying in the Fiddle Grove?" "I suppose I am," Thomas acknowledged, intrigued by her description of the place. "My name's Thomas Morgan. I've been camping here a few weeks now." "I'm Abigail Tanner," the girl responded with a formal little nod. "My papa and me, we live over the ridge yonder," she pointed vaguely eastward. "I come here sometimes to draw the trees. They make the prettiest patterns when the light comes through them." Thomas peered over her shoulder at the open sketchbook. The drawing was surprisingly skilled for one so young, a detailed rendering of the cottonwood grove, with particular attention to how sunlight filtered through the leaves. Even in pencil, Abigail had somehow captured the way light seemed to dance among the branches. "That's very good," he said with genuine admiration. "You have a fine eye for detail." Abigail beamed at the compliment. "Thank you, sir. Papa says I got it from my mama, though I don't remember her much myself. She died when I was little." The casual mention of her mother's death, delivered with the straightforward acceptance children often show for life's harshest realities, created an immediate bond of understanding between them. "I lost my wife not long ago," Thomas shared, surprised by how easily the words came. "That's partly why I'm out here, I suppose. Needed some time away from our home." Abigail nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. "The Fiddle Grove is a good place for sad hearts," she said with the unconscious wisdom of childhood. "That's what old Harlan says, anyways." "You know Harlan?" Thomas asked, settling himself on a nearby rock. "Everyone knows old Harlan," Abigail replied with a slight roll of her eyes that suggested adults asked unnecessarily obvious questions. "He brings us pelts sometimes, and Papa gives him supplies in trade. He tells the best stories, though Papa says half of them are taller than the trees." Thomas smiled at her assessment. "I met him yesterday. He told me about seeing a fiddler in the clearing down the creek. Do you know that story?" Abigail's expression brightened. "The ghost fiddler. I've heard him playing lots of times when I come to draw. Never seen him proper though, have you?" "I've heard the music," Thomas confirmed, "but never seen who's playing it." "You hear it often then?" "Most times when I'm here at sunset," Abigail said with a nod. "The music makes the leaves glow silver, even when there's no moon. I tried to draw it once, but you can't really catch music in a picture, can you?" The observation, so simple yet profound, struck Thomas deeply. "No, I don't suppose you can, though your drawings come closer than most might." Abigail smiled at that, then carefully closed her sketchbook and returned it to her satchel. "I should be getting home. Papa will be wondering where I've got to." She stood, brushing bits of bark from her dress. "Will you be here again tomorrow? I could bring my special drawings to show you, the ones of the clearing when the music's playing." Thomas found himself nodding. "I'd like that very much, Abigail." With a cheerful wave, the girl scampered off along a barely visible path that led eastward through the trees. Thomas watched until she disappeared from view, reflecting on how the peaceful grove seemed to be gradually filling with connections. First Harlan, now Abigail, each bringing their own perspective on the mysterious music that had drawn him initially. The day passed quietly as Thomas attended to practical tasks around his camp, mending a tear in his tent, fishing in the deeper pools of the creek, gathering firewood for evening. Yet underlying these routine activities was a growing anticipation for twilight and whatever it might bring. The previous night's musical experience had left him both emotionally drained and curiously hopeful, as if some frozen part of his spirit had begun to thaw. When evening finally approached, Thomas made his way deliberately to the circular clearing, arriving just as the sun dipped below the western ridge. He seated himself at the base of a cottonwood at the edge of the space, prepared to wait for however long necessary. Crickets began their evening chorus as shadows lengthened across the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called to the approaching night. The first notes of the fiddle emerged so gradually from these natural sounds that Thomas couldn't pinpoint exactly when music replaced nature. The transition was seamless, as if the creek's babble and the rustling leaves had organized themselves into melody. Tonight's music began with a gentle, pastoral tune that evoked open fields and simpler times. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him without attempting to recognize specific songs or search for hidden meanings. He wasn't certain how much time had passed when he became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere of the clearing. Opening his eyes, Thomas saw that full darkness had descended, with stars emerging overhead in their thousands. The massive central cottonwood seemed to glow with a faint luminescence, just as Abigail had described, its leaves shimmering silver despite the absence of moonlight. Then, as the fiddle music swelled into a more passionate melody, Thomas saw him, a figure standing beside the great tree, bow moving across strings with fluid grace. The fiddler appeared just as Harlan had described, a young man dressed in the style of an earlier era, playing with eyes closed and body swaying slightly to the rhythm of his own creation. Though the figure was translucent, the trunk of the cottonwood visible through his form. Every detail was crisp and clear, from the polished surface of the fiddle to the way his fingers pressed against the strings. Thomas held his breath, afraid that the slightest movement might disrupt this miraculous vision. The spectral musician continued playing, seemingly unaware of being observed. His face, young and somehow both serene and sorrowful, occasionally reflected emotions that matched the changing moods of the music, sometimes peaceful, sometimes yearning, occasionally breaking into a slight smile during more joyful passages. What struck Thomas most powerfully, however, was the fiddler's hands. Though the rest of him seemed firmly rooted in another time, with clothing and hairstyle from decades past, his hands were unmistakably familiar. The same slender fingers, the same distinctive way of holding the bow, that Thomas had watched countless times as Margaret played. Despite the masculine appearance of the spectral figure, those hands were hers, moving with her characteristic grace across the instrument. Understanding bloomed within Thomas's heart, a revelation that seemed both impossible and perfectly natural. The ghostly fiddler might appear as a young man from frontier days gone by, but the music, the soul of the performance, was Margaret's. Somehow, in this grove beside Driftwood Creek, where cottonwoods had stood sentinel for centuries and time itself seemed to flow differently, his wife had found a conduit for her music. As this realization settled into certainty, the tune changed once more, transforming into the gentle lullaby Margaret had composed when they learned she was carrying their child. Thomas rose slowly to his feet, no longer concerned about disrupting the vision. If this truly was Margaret's spirit in some form, she would know him, would welcome his approach rather than vanish at his movement. "Marguerite," he said softly, taking a step into the clearing. "I hear you." The fiddler's eyes remained closed, but the music responded, the melody gaining strength and clarity, individual notes ringing out with crystal precision in the night air. Thomas continued forward, moving slowly across the silvery grass until he stood just a few paces from the spectral musician. Now he could see every detail, the way the bow caught non-existent light as it moved, the slight tension in the fiddler's shoulders during more complicated passages, the peaceful expression that suggested playing was as natural as breathing. "I understand now," Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the emotions welling within him. "You found a way to reach me, to help me remember without pain. These past months, I've been so lost without you, so angry at being left behind." The music gentled, becoming a sweet, simple melody that they had often hummed together while working side by side on their homestead. Thomas felt tears on his cheeks, but made no move to wipe them away. These weren't the bitter tears of grief that had plagued him for months, but something cleaner, more healing, acknowledgement of love that transcended loss. "I don't know how this is possible," he said, gesturing to encompass the ghostly fiddler, the glowing cottonwood, the entire strange and beautiful situation. "And I don't much care." Harlan was right. The explanation doesn't matter near as much as the truth it brings. For the first time, the spectral fiddler's eyes opened, looking directly at Thomas. Though the face remained that of a young man from another time, the eyes that met his were unmistakably Margaret's. Dark, intelligent, filled with love and gentle humor. The music never faltered as those familiar eyes held his, communicating without words everything that needed to be said between them. Thomas stood transfixed, unwilling to break this impossible connection by speaking further. The fiddler played on, eyes now remaining open, gaze never leaving Thomas's face. One song flowed into another, their wedding dance, the tune Margaret had played when they'd finally saved enough to purchase their own land. Melodies that had accompanied every significant moment of their life together. Finally, as the night deepened around them and stars wheeled slowly overhead, the spectral fiddler began a tune Thomas had never heard before, something new, full of both gentle sorrow and profound peace. Listening to its progression from minor to major keys, from tension to resolution, Thomas understood it as Margaret's final gift to him, a melody that acknowledged their separation while offering promise of eventual reunion and continuing love, despite physical absence. As the last notes faded into the night air, the spectral fiddler lowered the instrument and offered a slight bow, exactly as Harlan had described years earlier. But instead of immediately disappearing into the cottonwood tree, the figure remained, looking at Thomas with those beloved eyes in a stranger's face. "I hear you," Thomas said again, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll keep listening, but I need to start living again too. That's what you're telling me, isn't it? The fiddler's lips curved into a gentle smile, and the translucent head nodded once in confirmation. Then, still holding Thomas's gaze, the figure stepped backward into the massive cottonwood trunk and vanished from sight, leaving only the silver glow of leaves stirring in the night breeze. Thomas remained in the clearing for hours afterward, seated at the base of the great tree, processing what he had experienced. By the time false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he had reached a sense of peace unlike anything he had known since Margaret's death. The crushing weight of grief hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something he could carry without being broken by it. A bittersweet awareness of profound love that continued beyond physical separation. As sunlight gradually penetrated the grove, turning silver leaves back to their normal green and white, Thomas made his way to his campsite. For the first time in months, he felt hungry, truly hungry, for breakfast, for coffee, for the simple pleasures of a new day. While tending his morning fire, he found himself humming the final melody the spectral fiddler had played, its progression from sorrow to acceptance matching his own emotional journey. Later that morning, true to her word, Abigail appeared with her leather satchel bulging with sketchbooks. Her face brightened when she saw Thomas sitting by a cheerful fire with coffee brewing. "You're still here," she exclaimed, dropping onto a fallen log beside his fire. "I brought my special drawings, just like I promised." Thomas smiled, finding genuine pleasure in the child's enthusiasm. "I'd love to see them, Abigail." She pulled out a larger sketchbook than the one she'd been using the previous day and carefully opened it to reveal a series of drawings, unlike her usual realistic style. These were more impressionistic, attempts to capture the magical quality of the clearing during the fiddler's performances. Swirling patterns of light wove through cottonwood branches. Musical notes seemed to float visibly in the air, and at the center of each drawing stood a suggestion of a figure, never fully rendered, but present nonetheless. "These are remarkable," Thomas said sincerely, turning pages slowly to study each drawing. "You've captured something most folks would say can't be drawn at all." Abigail beamed at his approval. "Papa doesn't quite understand these ones. He says they're pretty but peculiar. He's never heard the music himself, though he doesn't say I'm making it up. Just says I got an artist's way of seeing things regular folks might miss." "Your papa sounds like a wise man," Thomas observed, closing the sketchbook carefully and returning it to her. "Some people hear the music, some don't, but that doesn't make it any less real for those who do." Abigail tilted her head, studying him with surprising perception for one so young. "You look different today," she declared after a moment's consideration. "Less sad in your eyes. Did you hear the fiddle music again last night?" "I did," Thomas confirmed. "And I saw the fiddler too, just like in your drawings." Abigail's eyes widened. "Truly? What did he look like? Was he old or young? Did he speak to you?" Thomas considered how to answer, how much of his deeply personal experience to share with this curious child. He was young, he finally said, though his music held the wisdom of many years. He didn't speak with words, but his music said everything that needed saying. This response seemed to satisfy Abigail, who nodded sagely. "Old Harlan says music talks clearer than words, most times anyway. That's why the fiddler doesn't need to speak. His violin does all his talking for him." "Your friend Harlan is right about many things," Thomas agreed, pouring himself another cup of coffee. "Would you like some breakfast, Abigail? I was about to fry up some bacon." They shared a simple meal together, their conversation shifting to more ordinary topics. Abigail's schooling, which happened irregularly when the circuit teacher visited their small settlement. Her father's work as a blacksmith. Thomas' homestead back east, which now seemed more distant and somehow more accessible than it had just days before. As Abigail prepared to leave, gathering her precious sketchbooks back into her satchel, she paused to study Thomas once more. "Will you be staying in the Fiddle Grove much longer?" she asked. Thomas considered the question seriously. "A few more days, I think, then it'll be time for me to head back home. There's work waiting for me there, and people who depend on me." Abigail nodded, as if this was exactly the answer she had expected. "The Grove does that," she said with childlike certainty. "Helps folks remember what they need to go back to. That's what old Harlan says anyway, and he's been around just about forever." With a cheerful wave, she disappeared along her forest path, leaving Thomas to consider her words. The notion that this peaceful spot beside Driftwood Creek served some greater purpose, healing wounded hearts and reminding lost souls of connections that anchored them to life, seemed entirely plausible after what he had experienced. Thomas spent the remainder of the day putting his camp in order, not yet packing to leave, but beginning the mental preparation for returning to the world and responsibilities he had temporarily abandoned. The prospect no longer filled him with dread, as it might have just days earlier. Instead, he found himself considering practical improvements to the homestead, crops for the coming season, connections with neighbors that could be strengthened, future-oriented thoughts that had been absent during the dark months of grief. As twilight approached once more, Thomas made his way to the circular clearing, drawn by both habit and hope. The familiar progression from daylight to dusk unfolded around him, shadows lengthening across the grass, crickets beginning their evening chorus, cottonwood leaves rustling in the gentle breeze that seemed to flow reliably through the grove each evening. This time, however, no ethereal music emerged to complement nature's symphony. Thomas waited patiently as full darkness descended and stars appeared overhead, but the clearing remained silent save for ordinary woodland sounds. No ghostly fiddler materialized beside the great cottonwood. No silver glow illuminated its trembling leaves. Rather than disappointment, Thomas felt a curious sense of rightness about this development. Last night's experience had provided what he needed most: closure, connection, permission to continue living fully despite profound loss. Perhaps the spectral fiddler, whether truly Margaret's spirit or some more complex manifestation of this unusual place, appeared only when most needed, then retreated to allow natural healing to proceed. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly to the empty clearing, his words meant for Margaret, for the mysterious fiddler, for the ancient cottonwoods that had witnessed countless human sorrows and joys throughout their long existence. "I'll carry your music with me." Returning to his camp, Thomas built up his fire one last time and sat beneath the star-filled sky, feeling both the weight and wonder of being alive in a world where love lingered like notes in the wind, where connections transcended understanding, where healing came in forms both ordinary and miraculous. The following morning, Thomas packed his few belongings methodically, preparing for departure. He had decided to begin the journey home, a trip that would take several days across varied terrain. The prospect of return no longer seemed like surrender to unbearable emptiness, but rather a continuation of life's melody, altered by loss, but still containing possibilities for harmony and meaning. As he saddled Samson, adjusting the cinch with practiced hands, Thomas became aware of movement at the edge of the grove. Looking up, he saw Harlan approaching, rifle resting casually against one shoulder, as seemed to be his habit. Heading out, I see, the old trapper observed, coming to stand beside Thomas's horse. Found what you needed in the fiddle grove? Thomas nodded, securing his bedroll behind the saddle. I believe I have, though I'm still not entirely sure I understand what happened here. Harlan's weatherline face creased in a smile that conveyed both wisdom and humor. Understanding's overrated when it comes to certain things. Experience is what matters, and what you carry forward from it. You sound like my wife, Thomas observed with a small smile of his own. She always did prefer wisdom to mere knowledge. Sounds like a remarkable woman, Harlan said, leaning against a nearby tree trunk. The kind who leaves echoes long after she's gone. Thomas paused in his preparations, studying the old man thoughtfully. How much do you know about the fiddler, Harlan? You've been here longer than anyone. Is it always the same? Does everyone see and hear the same things? Harlan took his time answering, removing his battered hat to run gnarled fingers through thinning white hair. The fiddle grove works differently for each person who needs its medicine, he finally said. Some hear music that reminds them of home when they've wandered too far. Others hear tunes that give them courage for journeys they need to undertake. A few, like yourself, find connections to loved ones they feared were lost forever. And the fiddler, Thomas pressed, the young man I saw by the great cottonwood, is he always the same person? Ah, now that's the real mystery, Harlan replied, his eyes twinkling. The figure changes, though the clearing remains constant. I've spoken with travelers over the years who described seeing an old man playing, or a young woman, or even a child. Yet the music always seems perfect for whoever's listening. Exactly what they need to hear, exactly when they need to hear it. This revelation both surprised Thomas and confirmed what he had already suspected, that the spectral fiddler was more complex than a simple ghost story might suggest, more personally tailored to each observer's needs than a mere haunting could explain. So the hands I saw, Thomas began, then stopped, finding it difficult to articulate the deeply personal nature of his experience. Harlan nodded understanding. Were your wife's hands most likely, playing just as she would have played? The fiddle grove shows us what we need to see, lets us hear what our hearts need most. That's its gift, though I couldn't tell you who or what bestows it. Thomas mounted his horse, settling into the saddle and gathering the reins. Does everyone who camps here experience the music then? Is that why this spot remains relatively undisturbed despite its beauty? Not everyone, Harlan said, stepping back to give the horse room. Only those with ears to hear and hearts that need healing. Others might camp a month in this very spot and notice nothing more unusual than particularly pretty trees or exceptionally bright stars. This selectivity explained why the grove hadn't become widely known for supernatural occurrences, despite its remarkable properties. The experiences it offered were too personal, too specifically tailored to individual needs to generate consistent reports that might attract attention from the wider world. I'm grateful to have been one with ears to hear, then, Thomas said sincerely. This place has given me something I didn't even know I was seeking. Harlan nodded, replacing his hat. That's generally how it works. The fiddle grove has its own wisdom about what ails us, often clearer than our own understanding of our troubles. Thomas extended his hand, which the old trapper clasped firmly. Thank you, Harlan, for sharing what you know, and for letting me find what I needed to discover on my own. Safe journey home, Thomas Morgan, Harlan replied. And remember, the music doesn't stay in the grove. It goes where it's carried, in memories and changed hearts. With a final nod of acknowledgement, Thomas turned his horse toward the east, and began the long journey home. As he rode, he found himself humming the final melody the spectral fiddler had played, that beautiful progression from sorrow to acceptance that now seemed to form the soundtrack for his own continuing life. Though he left the cottonwood grove behind, Thomas carried with him more than memories of mysterious music and impossible visions. He carried renewed purpose, healing that transcended rational explanation, and the profound understanding that love, like certain melodies, never truly ends. It simply changes form, continuing to resonate through lives it has touched even when its original source can no longer be seen. Months later, settled back into the rhythms of his homestead, with renewed appreciation for its familiar comforts and challenges. Thomas unpacked Margaret's fiddle from the trunk, where it had lain untouched since her passing. Carefully cleaning and restringing the instrument, he placed it not back in storage, but on a special stand in the main room of their home, a visible reminder of music that continued despite absence, of connections that transcended ordinary understanding. Sometimes in the evenings, especially when twilight painted the sky in colors that reminded him of cottonwood leaves catching the last light of day, Thomas would swear he heard faint strains of fiddle music drifting through the open windows of his home, not mournful or haunting, but peaceful and somehow encouraging. Whether these subtle melodies originated from memory, imagination, or something more mysterious remained impossible to determine with certainty. In the end, as both Harlan and Margaret would have agreed, the explanation mattered far less than the comfort it brought, the reminder that some connections never truly break, that love lingered like notes in the wind long after the visible musician had departed, that healing came in many forms to hearts open to receiving it. And sometimes, on particularly clear nights when stars shone with extraordinary brilliance, Thomas would step outside onto his porch and listen to the symphony of night sounds, crickets, distant coyotes, the rustling of wind through autumn dry cornfields. Certain that somewhere within this natural music, Margaret's fiddle still played, neither fully present nor truly gone, but continuing in that liminal space where love and memory transform loss into its own kind of eternal harmony. As the last echoes of the fiddle's melody faded into the night, the stars continued their slow dance across the velvet sky. The cottonwoods stood sentinel along Driftwood Creek, their leaves whispering secrets of those who had found solace beneath their ancient branches. Thomas Morgan's story, like the music that had healed his grieving heart, now drifts into memory, carried away by the same gentle breeze that stirs the campfire before us. The embers glow, casting long shadows across the prairie grass as we turn our attention to another tale from the frontier, a story of connection that transcends ordinary understanding. From ethereal melodies that bridge worlds, we now journey to an object crafted by human hands, yet somehow imbued with something beyond explanation. As night deepens around us, let your mind wander along dusty trails to a different corner of this vast land, where another mystery awaits beneath the endless western sky. The town of Dust Creek was little more than a handful of weathered buildings clinging to existence along the edge of an old trading route. It had been established in more prosperous days when the stagecoach line ran regular, but now, with the railroad having chosen a route some 30 miles north, it persisted mainly through stubborn habit and the loyalty of ranchers who'd settled the surrounding valleys generations ago. At the far end of the town's single street stood Patterson's stable, its wooden frame leaning slightly eastward as if perpetually bracing against the prevailing winds that swept down from the mesas. The stable had been built by Jeremiah Patterson in 1867, back when he'd had dreams of establishing a horse trading business to serve travelers moving west. Those ambitions had faded with time, much like the once bright paint that had adorned the building's exterior. Now, some 40 years later, the stable primarily boarded local ranch horses and the occasional traveler's mount, while offering modest livery services to those passing through. The ownership had passed to Jeremiah's son Thomas some 15 years prior, though the elder Patterson's influence remained throughout, from the unusual height of the stall doors to the small carved initials hidden in the corner posts of each stall. Inside, the stable possessed a quality of light unlike anywhere else in Dust Creek. Thin beams of sunlight filtered through gaps in the exterior boards, creating golden shafts that cut through the perpetual dust and hay particles suspended in the air. These natural spotlights would shift throughout the day, illuminating different corners of the building as the sun made its journey across the sky. In a late afternoon, when the sun hung low in the western sky, the entire stable took on an amber glow that transformed the ordinary into something approaching sacred. It was during one such golden hour that young Ellis Harding first noticed the saddle. Ellis had started working at Patterson's stable 3 months prior, having arrived in Dust Creek with little more than the clothes on his back and a desire to put distance between himself and the mining town where he'd grown up. At 22, he was lean but strong, with a quiet demeanor that suited the solitary work of tending to horses and cleaning stalls. Thomas Patterson had hired him without asking too many questions, a courtesy that Ellis deeply appreciated, and had been pleased with the young man's work ethic and gentle way with the animals. That particular evening, Ellis had been tasked with reorganizing the tack room, a small adjoining space where saddles, bridles, and various other riding equipment were stored. Thomas had mentioned that some items hadn't been properly returned to their places in quite some time, and Ellis was determined to impose some order on the cluttered space. He'd been working steadily for nearly 2 hours, the sweat beading on his forehead despite the relatively cool temperature inside the stable, when he moved a stack of old horse blankets and uncovered something unexpected. There, resting on a simple wooden stand that had clearly been crafted specifically for this purpose, was a saddle unlike any Ellis had encountered before. Its leather was dark with age, nearly black in the deeper creases, but maintained a rich amber hue where the surface caught the light. The saddle horn was simple but elegant, lacking the ostentatious silver caps favored by showier riders. What struck Ellis most, however, was the craftsmanship evident in every stitch and curve. This had been made by someone who understood both horses and riders intimately. Ellis reached out almost without thinking, his fingertips tracing the intricate tooling along the saddle's skirt. Small scenes had been worked into the leather, a herd of wild horses running across open country, a rider silhouetted against a sunset, mountains rising in stylized peaks. The images flowed together in a continuous circular narrative, telling a story that seemed to have no beginning or end. Despite the dust that had settled over much of the saddle, these images remained surprisingly distinct, as if something, or someone, had occasionally wiped away the accumulation over the years. "That's Caleb Winter's saddle," came a voice from behind him. Ellis startled slightly, turning to find Thomas Patterson standing in the tack room doorway. The older man's expression was difficult to read, something between nostalgia and caution. "I didn't mean to disturb anything, Mr. Patterson," Ellis said quickly. "I was just organizing like you asked." Thomas shook his head, stepping forward to stand beside Ellis. "You're not disturbing anything. That saddle's been sitting there so long I sometimes forget it's even here." He reached out, brushing some dust from the cantle with a gentleness that seemed reserved for precious things. "Caleb was a friend of my father's, one of the best horsemen this territory ever knew." Ellis looked back at the saddle with renewed interest. It's beautiful work, made by a saddle maker in Santa Fe. Caleb saved for 2 years to commission it. Thomas smiled faintly at some private memory. Used to say, a good saddle was worth more than gold to a man who lived on horseback. The way Thomas spoke, with reverence and a hint of sorrow, suggested there was more to the story. Ellis hesitated, not wanting to pry but intensely curious about the saddle that had clearly been preserved with such care. What happened to him? Ellis finally asked, keeping his voice respectfully quiet as if they were standing in a church rather than a dusty tack room. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his weathered hand still resting on the saddle's leather. Winter of '83, he finally said. Blizzard came in faster than anyone expected. Caleb was bringing some strays back to his ranch when it hit. They found him and his horse in the spring thaw, about 15 miles from here. Looked like he'd tried to make it to a line shack but got disoriented in the whiteout. Ellis felt a chill despite the evening warmth, and the saddle came here. Caleb had no family to speak of. His small spread went to pay his debts, and his few possessions were sold or claimed by neighbors. Thomas patted the saddle gently. My father couldn't bear to see this saddle go to someone who wouldn't understand its value, so he bought it himself. Kept it right here ever since. The older man's eyes took on a distant quality. That was more than 20 years ago now. Dad passed 10 years back, but I've kept the saddle right where he left it. Seems like the proper thing to do. Ellis nodded, understanding completely, though he couldn't have explained why. There was something about the saddle that seemed to demand respect, not merely for its craftsmanship or its age, but for the life it represented. It should stay right here, Ellis agreed softly. Thomas looked at him with what might have been approval before turning toward the door. Finish up when you can, Ellis. No rush. I'll see you in the morning. Left alone in the tack room, Ellis found himself drawn back to the saddle. The last rays of sunlight streaming through the western window fell directly upon it now, illuminating the worn leather and making the tooled images seem almost to move in the shifting light. Ellis completed his organization of the other items, but found himself returning to the saddle several times, adjusting its position slightly to better catch the light, carefully wiping away dust from its surface with a soft cloth. By the time he closed up the stable for the night, Ellis had spent nearly an hour tending to Caleb Winter's saddle, though he couldn't have explained why it had captured his attention so completely. As he walked the short distance to his small room behind the town's general store, he found himself wondering about the man who had ridden that saddle across country, now transformed by fences and railroads. Wondering what stories might be worn into the leather, along with those carved images of wild horses and distant mountains. That night, Ellis dreamed of open plains and endless sky, though he'd never seen country so vast in his waking life. He dreamed of a horse's steady rhythm beneath him, and the creak of leather as familiar as his own heartbeat. He dreamed of a voice humming low songs that had no words but somehow spoke of freedom and solitude, and the particular kind of peace that comes from being utterly alone, yet completely at home in the world. When he woke just before dawn, Ellis lay still for several minutes, trying to hold on to the fragments of those dreams that already seemed to be fading. There had been something important there, something he needed to understand or remember, but it slipped away like water through cupped hands, leaving only a vague sense of loss and longing. Rising to begin his day at the stable, Ellis couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, though nothing in his routine or surroundings was different. It wasn't until he entered the tack room to retrieve a bridle for one of the border horses that he realized what it was. The saddle seemed to be waiting for him, catching the early morning light in a way that made the tooled images stand out with unusual clarity. Ellis found himself approaching it almost reverently, drawn by some instinct he didn't fully comprehend. "Good morning," he said softly, feeling both foolish and strangely comfortable speaking to the empty saddle. His fingers traced the worn leather of the seat, where a man had sat for countless miles, through sun and rain and who knew what adventures or hardships. "I hope you don't mind me cleaning you up a bit yesterday." For just a moment, so briefly he might have imagined it, Ellis felt a sensation like a light breeze against his face, carrying the scent of sage and open country. Then it was gone, leaving him alone in the quiet tack room with only dust motes dancing in the morning light for company. Shaking his head at his own fanciful thoughts, Ellis retrieved the bridle he needed and went about his morning chores. There were stalls to clean, horses to feed and water, a delivery of hay to unload, ordinary tasks that kept his hands busy, if not his mind. Throughout the day, he found his thoughts returning to the saddle and to the fragments of his dreams that still lingered at the edges of his consciousness. That evening, after the day's work was complete and Thomas had headed home to his family, Ellis returned to the tack room. The saddle sat in its place, ordinary yet somehow compelling in the fading light. Ellis pulled up a small wooden stool and settled beside it, not touching it now, but simply sitting in its presence, as the last golden rays of sun filtered through the western window. "Mr. Patterson says you belonged to a man named Caleb Winters," Ellis said quietly. "Says he was quite the horseman." He paused, feeling slightly foolish for talking to an inanimate object, yet unable to deny the strange sense of companionship he felt. "I wonder what kind of man he was. What kind of places you two saw together." As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows lengthened across the stable floor, Ellis continued his one-sided conversation. He spoke of his own life, his childhood in a mining town where the sun rarely seemed to shine through the perpetual coal dust in the air, his father's early death in a cave-in, his mother's slow decline afterward. He spoke of his decision to leave, to seek something different, though he hadn't known exactly what he was looking for. "I just knew I needed sky," he explained to the silent saddle. "Space to breathe. Does that make any sense at all?" The stable had grown quite dark, with only faint silver moonlight now filtering through the high windows. Ellis knew he should light a lantern or head back to his room, but there was something peaceful about sitting in the gathering darkness, something comforting about the solid presence of the saddle beside him. Just as he was about to rise, Ellis felt it, a subtle shift in the air around him, like the gentle pressure change before a distant storm. The moonlight seemed to intensify, focusing on the saddle in a way that couldn't be entirely natural. And then came a sensation so strange, yet so familiar, that Ellis found himself holding his breath. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like the feeling of words forming in his mind, accompanied by images so vivid they might have been memories. Except they couldn't possibly be his memories. He saw endless grasslands stretching to a horizon so distant it seemed to curve with the earth itself. He felt the powerful muscles of a horse moving beneath him, the rhythmic hoofbeats like a heartbeat connecting him to the land. He tasted dust and mountain water, felt the sting of sleet against his face, and the warm caress of summer sun on his neck. And through it all ran a thread of something like joy, simple contentment in solitude, appreciation for beauty that required no witness to validate it, peace in the face of nature's vast indifference. These weren't emotions Ellis had experienced himself, at least not with such intensity, yet they flowed through him now as if they were his own. The experience lasted only moments, though it seemed much longer. When it faded, Ellis found himself sitting in ordinary darkness once more, his hand somehow having come to rest on the saddle's worn leather. He drew a shaky breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Caleb," he whispered uncertainly. The stable remained silent, save for the occasional soft shuffling of horses in their stalls. Ellis sat motionless for several minutes more, but the strange sensations didn't return. Finally, he rose on slightly unsteady legs, gave the saddle one last wondering look, and made his way out of the stable toward his room. That night, his dreams were even more vivid than before. He rode across landscapes he'd never seen, canyons so deep their floors remained in perpetual shadow, forests of pines that reached higher than church steeples, meadows carpeted with wildflowers in impossible profusion. He forded rivers swollen with spring melt, their currents tugging at his horse's legs. He sheltered beneath overhanging rocks during sudden violent downpours, and dozed beneath star-filled skies so vast they made him feel simultaneously insignificant and profound. Throughout these dreams ran the constant presence of a horse. Not always the same horse, but always familiar, trusted, the partnership between rider and mount seamless after countless miles shared. And though Ellis couldn't see himself in these dreams, couldn't know if he appeared as himself or as someone else entirely, he felt complete in a way his waking life had never allowed. Morning came too soon, pulling Ellis reluctantly from these vivid dreamscapes back to his narrow bed in his small room. He lay still for several moments, savoring the lingering sensations of freedom and connection that the dreams had brought. There was no doubt in his mind now, though he couldn't explain how or why, that what he was experiencing was somehow Caleb Winter's memories, preserved in the leather and wood of the saddle he'd ridden for so many years. The rational part of Ellis's mind suggested this was merely imagination, his own longing for adventure and purpose projecting itself through the story Thomas had told him. Yet there was a quality to the experiences, a specificity to details he couldn't possibly know, that defied such simple explanation. How could he dream of places he'd never seen with such clarity? How could he feel the particular gait of a horse he'd never ridden? As autumn progressed into early winter, Ellis developed a routine. His days were filled with the ordinary work of the stable, caring for horses, mending tack, unloading supplies, while his evenings increasingly belonged to the saddle. He would sit beside it after Thomas had gone home, sometimes talking softly about his day or his thoughts, other times simply sitting in companionable silence as darkness gathered around them. Not every evening brought the strange sensations he had experienced that first night. Some nights the saddle remained simply a well-crafted but inanimate object, its stories dormant within the worn leather. But on other evenings, particularly when the moon was bright or when storms gathered on the horizon, Ellis would feel that subtle shift in the air, that gentle pressure at the edges of his consciousness, and another fragment of Caleb Winter's life would unfold within him. He experienced a buffalo hunt conducted by a band of Comanche, observed from a respectful distance as the riders demonstrated horsemanship beyond anything Ellis had ever imagined. He felt the bone-deep cold of a high mountain pass, traversed too late in the season, where each breath crystallized instantly, and the horses' exhales created plumes of steam that froze in the still air. He knew the simple pleasure of smoking a pipe beside a small campfire, watching sparks rise towards stars while coyotes called to one another across vast distances. With each of these experiences, Ellis felt himself changing in subtle ways. He found himself standing straighter, speaking more confidently when the occasion required. He developed an even deeper patience with the horses in his care, understanding their moods and needs with an intuition that sometimes startled even Thomas. He began to feel a connection to the land around Dust Creek, not the deep knowledge that came from growing up in a place, but something more elemental, a recognition of patterns and relationships that transcended specific locations. "You've settled in well here," Thomas commented one afternoon as they worked together to repair a broken stall door. "When you first showed up, I wasn't sure you'd stay past the first month. Most young men passing through are looking for excitement, not stable work in a town barely hanging on." Ellis considered this as he held a board steady for Thomas to nail. "I guess I found what I needed here," he said finally, thinking of the saddle and its whispered stories rather than the town itself. Thomas gave him a penetrating look. "Funny thing about finding what you need. It's rarely what you thought you were looking for." One evening in early December, as Ellis sat beside the saddle while snow fell softly outside, the stable door opened unexpectedly. Ellis looked up, startled, to see Micah Jenkins stepping inside, stamping snow from his boots. Micah was the town's blacksmith, a powerfully built man of few words who kept largely to himself. Ellis had spoken with him only a handful of times since arriving in Dust Creek, mostly regarding horseshoes or repairs to metal fixtures around the stable. "Evening," Micah said, nodding briefly to Ellis. "Thomas around?" "Went home early. His youngest has a cough." Ellis stood, curious about the unexpected visit. "Can I help with something?" Micah shook his head, removing his heavy coat and hanging it on a peg near the door. "Just came to sit a spell, if that's all right." Before Ellis could respond, Micah was already moving past him toward the tack room. Ellis followed, puzzled, to find the blacksmith standing before Caleb's saddle with an expression that might have been reverence on his usually stoic face. "You know about the saddle," Ellis said, understanding dawning. Micah glanced at him briefly before returning his gaze to the worn leather. "My father worked with Caleb sometimes, breaking horses too spirited for most men to handle. I was just a boy then, but I remember him well." The blacksmith reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, which he placed carefully at the base of the saddle stand. Ellis was surprised to see it was a dried flower, a daisy preserved from the previous summer. "You leave flowers for the saddle," Ellis said softly, remembering Thomas mentioning someone who did this, but never saying who. Micah nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "Been doing it since I took over my father's forge. Started with fresh ones when they were in season. Now I dry some each summer to last the winter months." His large calloused hand hovered near the saddle's flank for a moment, but didn't touch it. "Caleb taught me to ride when I was 8 years old. Said every man should know how to speak to a horse, even if blacksmithing was to be my trade." They stood in silence for several moments, the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, and the muffled fall of snow outside the only interruptions. Ellis sensed that Micah, like himself, felt some connection to the saddle and the man who had once ridden it, though whether the blacksmith had experienced anything like the vivid impressions Ellis had received, he couldn't guess. "You sit with it often?" Micah finally asked, his eyes still on the saddle. Ellis hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "Most evenings," he admitted. "There's something peaceful about it." Micah nodded as if this made perfect sense. "It's good someone's keeping it company. Things that have been part of a man's life for that long, they hold something of him, I think. Do you ever feel like," Ellis began, then paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish, "like it's trying to tell you something?" The blacksmith turned to look at him directly now, his expression unreadable in the dimly lit tack room. For a moment, Ellis feared he'd said too much, revealed something that would mark him as unstable or fanciful in the eyes of this practical man. But Micah surprised him. "Not telling," he said slowly. "Reminding, maybe, of things we know but forget in the busyness of living." He turned back to the saddle. "Caleb used to say that leather remembers everything it's been through. Every storm, every hot day, every river crossing. Said a good saddle was like a diary you write with your life instead of a pen." Ellis felt an unexpected warmth spread through him at these words. Confirmation that he wasn't alone in sensing something special about this particular saddle, even if his experiences went beyond what Micah was describing. The blacksmith didn't stay long. After a few more minutes of silent contemplation, he nodded to Ellis, retrieved his coat, and disappeared back into the snowy evening. But his visit left Ellis with a new perspective on his experiences. Perhaps what was happening wasn't as strange as it had seemed. Perhaps it was simply a different kind of remembering. Memories preserved not in mind or paper, but in well-worn leather that had absorbed the essence of a life lived fully. That night, as Ellis sat beside the saddle in the deepening quiet of the stable, he found himself speaking more openly than before. "I think I understand better now," he told the saddle softly. "You're not haunted. You're hallowed. There's a difference, isn't there?" The stable seemed to grow warmer around him, though the December night outside was bitter cold. The familiar pressure began at the edges of his awareness, gentle but insistent, and Ellis closed his eyes to better receive whatever impressions might come. This time, what flowed into him wasn't a specific memory or scene, but rather a complex tapestry of emotions and understanding. He felt Caleb's deep connection to the rhythms of the natural world, the migrations of birds and animals, the cycling of seasons, the ancient patterns of growth and decline that continued regardless of human concerns. He sensed the horseman's appreciation for solitude not as an absence of company, but as a presence of something else, something vast and enduring that required quiet attention to perceive. Most powerfully, Ellis experienced Caleb's relationship with his horses over the years, the delicate negotiation of trust between two very different species, the wordless communication developed through countless miles and shared dangers, the profound respect for these creatures who lent humans their speed and strength with so little asked in return. It was a perspective on horsemanship that went far beyond technique or control, approaching something more like partnership or even kinship. When the impressions finally faded, Ellis remained sitting with his eyes closed, absorbing what he had received. The stable was now fully dark, save for slivers of moonlight filtering through frost-covered windows, but he felt no desire to move or light a lantern. The darkness seemed appropriate somehow, a space in which ordinary seeing gave way to deeper perception. "Thank you," he whispered finally, resting his hand lightly on the saddle's worn leather. "I'll try to remember." In the stall nearest the tack room door, old Bess, a blind mule who had belonged to Thomas's father, snorted softly, as if in agreement. Ellis smiled, remembering how he'd often observed the ancient animal, pausing by the tack room entrance during her daily walk to the paddock, stretching her neck to nudge the doorframe, as if checking that something important remained in its proper place. "You've been keeping secrets too, haven't you?" Ellis said to the mule, who pricked her ears forward at the sound of his voice. The following day brought heavy snow and bitter wind, keeping all but the most determined residents of Dust Creek indoors. Ellis spent the morning in the stable, ensuring the horses were comfortable and well fed, then helping Thomas reinforce the doors against the driving wind. By mid-afternoon, even Thomas conceded that the weather had won the day. "No point in both of us staying," he told Ellis, wrapping a scarf around his neck in preparation for the short but brutal walk to his home. "I'm going to check on my family. The youngest isn't improving as quickly as my wife would like." Ellis nodded, concerned for Tamar's child, but also secretly pleased at the prospect of having the stable to himself for the remainder of the day. "I'll keep an eye on things here, make sure nothing freezes that shouldn't." After Thomas departed, battling his way through snowdrifts already reaching mid-thigh in places, Ellis made himself comfortable in the stable. The solid wooden building provided excellent shelter from the storm, and the collective body heat of the horses and mule kept the interior reasonably warm despite the dropping temperature outside. Ellis added extra hay to each stall, checked water buckets to ensure they hadn't begun to ice over, and spoke soothingly to the animals, who were understandably restless with the howling wind rattling the building's timbers. As twilight approached, earlier than usual due to the heavy cloud cover, Ellis found himself drawn once again to the tack room. The saddle waited in its accustomed place, seeming somehow more substantial in the dim, snow-filtered light. Ellis settled onto his stool beside it, listening to the wind's mournful song around the eaves of the stable. "Sounds like a bad one," he commented to the saddle. "Reminds me of what Mr. Patterson said about the blizzard that caught you and Caleb." He hesitated, uncertain if this was an appropriate topic to raise. "I wonder if you remember that day. For several minutes, nothing happened beyond the normal sounds of the storm and the occasional restless movement of a horse in its stall." Ellis hadn't really expected a response. The saddle's stories seemed to come according to their own timetable rather than on request. He was about to rise and check on the animals again when he felt it, that now familiar shift in the air, the subtle pressure against his consciousness that signaled the beginning of another vision. This time, however, what flowed into him was darker and more fragmented than previous experiences. He caught glimpses rather than complete scenes. A sky that transformed from clear blue to threatening grey with unnatural speed. The growing concern of a rider as visibility diminished to mere feet ahead, the desperate search for landmarks rendered suddenly unfamiliar beneath thickening snow, a horse's laboured breathing as it pushed through deepening drifts. Most distressing was the gradual awareness of fatal miscalculation, the recognition coming too late that the storm was not one to be waited out on horseback. That shelter should have been sought immediately, rather than pressing on toward a destination that remained tantalizingly close, yet impossible to reach in deteriorating conditions. Ellis felt the creeping cold, the increasing difficulty of clear thought as hypothermia began its insidious work, the desperate attempt to keep moving when every instinct cried out for rest. And then, unexpectedly, came something else. Not fear or regret, as Ellis might have anticipated, but a strange, calm acceptance. He sensed Caleb's final thoughts turning not to his own fate, but to concern for his horse, trapped in this situation by human decision. He felt the rider's remorse at having failed the animal that had trusted him, followed by a kind of surrendering, not to death exactly, but to the natural order that claimed all living things in its own time and way. The last impression was of peace descending like the snow itself, quiet, enveloping, transforming the landscape of consciousness until individual concerns gave way to something larger and more enduring. Not happiness, certainly, but a dissolution of the boundaries between self and world that brought its own profound comfort. When the vision faded, Ellis found his face wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. The tack room remained dim and quiet around him, the storm outside continuing unabated, but something fundamental had shifted in his understanding. What he had just experienced wasn't merely memory or impression. It was something more intimate, a sharing of the most profound moment of another human being's existence. "You didn't just show me his life," Ellis whispered to the saddle. "You showed me his death." Yet strangely, he felt no fear or revulsion at this realization. The experience, though sobering, had contained a kind of beauty he hadn't expected, an insight into the final moments of a life that had been lived with such presence and authenticity that even its ending carried meaning rather than merely tragedy. Ellis remained beside the saddle, deep into the night, the storm gradually subsiding around the stable until only occasional gusts reminded of its earlier fury. He didn't speak again, sensing that words were inadequate for what had passed between them. Instead, he simply sat in quiet communion with the worn leather and the spirit it somehow preserved, allowing the understanding he had gained to settle into his own consciousness, like snow finding its final resting place on the winter landscape. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Dust Creek transformed beneath a pristine blanket of white. Ellis emerged from the stable to find the town eerily silent, smoke rising in straight columns from chimneys against a sky so intensely blue it almost hurt to look at it. The temperature had dropped further during the night, turning the fresh snow to a squeaking powder beneath his boots as he made his way to his room to change clothes. Throughout the day, as he worked to clear paths around the stable and check on the condition of the horses after the stressful night, Ellis found himself moving with a new sense of purpose and clarity. The vision of Caleb's final journey had affected him deeply, not as a cautionary tale, but as a glimpse into a way of being in the world that embraced both its joys and its inevitable conclusions, with the same steady presence. Thomas returned mid-morning, looking weary but relieved. The youngest turned the corner last night, he reported. Fever broke just before dawn. Doctor says he'll be fine with rest. Ellis nodded, genuinely pleased for the family. Good news. The animals weathered the storm well, no problems here. As the day progressed and the town gradually returned to its normal rhythms, Ellis found himself watching others with fresh eyes. He observed Micah at his forge, the blacksmith's powerful arms working iron with a care and precision that spoke of deep respect for his materials. He noticed Mrs. Wallace at the general store, measuring out goods for customers with scrupulous fairness, her weathered hands moving with the confidence of decades of practice. He saw Thomas checking each horse with methodical attention, missing nothing that might indicate discomfort or illness. These ordinary people living ordinary lives suddenly seemed extraordinary to Ellis, each engaged in their own particular conversation with the world, each leaving their mark in ways they might never fully recognize. Just as Caleb had left his essence somehow imprinted in the leather of his saddle, these people were inscribing themselves into the fabric of their community through countless small actions and choices. That evening, Ellis returned to the tack room with a sense of both anticipation and acceptance. Whatever the saddle might share, or not share, he felt prepared to receive it with appropriate reverence. He had brought a small lantern this time, setting it on a shelf where its warm light fell gently across the tooled leather, highlighting the intricate seams that circled the saddle's skirt. "I understand better now," he told the saddle quietly. Not just about Caleb, but about what he understood, about how to be in the world. The stable was peaceful around him, the horses settling for the night with soft snuffles and occasional stamping. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, stars appearing in the clear sky like ice crystals suspended in the blackness. Ellis sat comfortably on his stool, no longer awkward or uncertain in this strange communion. The familiar pressure began at the edges of his awareness, gentle and welcome now rather than startling. But unlike previous occasions, what flowed into Ellis this time wasn't a memory or scene from the past. Instead, he experienced a sort of invitation, a sense of possibility opening before him like a trail leading into unexplored country. He saw himself continuing at the stable, not merely as a temporary stop on some uncertain journey, but as a place where his own story might unfold with meaning and purpose. He glimpsed himself learning from Thomas, from Micah, from the other residents of Dust Creek, who carried their own wisdom and skills. Most significantly, he saw himself developing the same deep attentiveness to the world around him that had characterized Caleb's life. The careful observation of natural patterns, the respectful partnership with animals, the appreciation for beauty in ordinary moments. It wasn't a vision of dramatic adventures or grand achievements. It was something quieter, yet somehow more profound. A life of presence and integrity, of work that mattered because it was done well, of connections to people and places and animals that were honored rather than taken for granted. When the impressions faded, Ellis remained sitting quietly in the lantern light, absorbing what had been offered. Unlike previous occasions when the saddle's stories had left him contemplating Caleb's experiences, this time he found himself looking toward his own future with new clarity and purpose. "Thank you," he said finally, resting his hand on the worn leather seat where countless miles had been ridden. "For the memories, for the understanding, for the welcome." In the nearest stall, old Bess nickered softly, as if in agreement. Ellis smiled, rising to extinguish the lantern before making his way out of the tack room. At the doorway he paused, looking back at the saddle now visible only as a deeper shadow among shadows. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised quietly. And many tomorrows after that. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Ellis continued his evening visits to the tack room, sometimes experiencing new glimpses of Caleb's memories, other times simply sitting in companionable silence beside the saddle. He began to notice that these visions or impressions often seemed to come in response to questions or challenges he was facing in his own life. Not providing direct answers, but offering perspectives that helped him find his own way forward. Micah continued his occasional visits as well, though he rarely stayed long and spoke even less. He and Ellis developed a comfortable understanding, exchanging minimal words but sharing the unspoken acknowledgement of the saddle's special significance. When spring finally arrived in earnest, bringing the first wild flowers to the hills around Dust Creek, Micah appeared one evening with a fresh daisy, the first of the season, which he placed carefully at the base of the saddle stand, with the same reverence Ellis had observed months earlier. "First one I've seen this year," the blacksmith explained briefly. "Thought Caleb would want to know spring's properly arrived." Ellis nodded, understanding completely. "I'm sure he appreciates it." They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes before Micah departed with a simple nod of farewell. As the door closed behind him, Ellis turned back to the saddle, now illuminated by the golden light of late afternoon streaming through the western window. "You've created quite a community around yourself," he observed with a smile. "For something that's supposed to be inanimate, you managed to bring people together rather effectively." The saddle remained silent in the conventional sense, but Ellis had long since learned to perceive its communications in other ways. The particular way light played across its worn surface, the subtle changes in the stable's atmosphere, the quiet understanding that seemed to flow between the leather and his own consciousness. In the months since his arrival in Dust Creek, Ellis had changed in ways both subtle and profound. He stood straighter, spoke with quiet confidence when necessary, and had developed relationships with the residents of the small town who had initially regarded him as just another drifter passing through. Thomas had formally promoted him to assistant manager of the stable, acknowledging the careful work and genuine connection with the animals that Ellis demonstrated daily. Most significantly, Ellis had found within himself a capacity for contentment he hadn't known he possessed. An ability to be fully present in each moment without restless yearning for something else, somewhere else. The dreams of freedom and endless horizons that had initially drawn him to Caleb's saddle had gradually transformed into appreciation for the freedom and beauty available in the life he was actually living. That evening, as Ellis sat beside the saddle with the fresh daisy providing a bright counterpoint to the aged leather, he felt the familiar, gentle pressure that signaled another sharing. This time, the impressions that flowed into him were fragmentary, yet deeply moving. Caleb as a young man receiving the newly crafted saddle, his pride and care as he oiled the pristine leather, Caleb in his prime, confidently guiding inexperienced riders in proper horsemanship, Caleb in later years, sometimes speaking aloud to the saddle during long, solitary journeys, as if it were a trusted companion rather than mere equipment. The sequence concluded with a scene Ellis hadn't witnessed before. Caleb sitting beside a campfire beneath stars much like those visible above Dust Creek, smoking his pipe and contemplating the saddle resting nearby. The horseman's thoughts, somehow conveyed across decades to Ellis's consciousness, were peaceful and philosophical, reflections on the good fortune of having found work that matched his temperament, of having traveled country that never ceased to inspire wonder, of having formed partnerships with horses that enriched his understanding of communication beyond human language. As the vision faded, leaving Ellis once again alone with the saddle in the quiet stable, he felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a circularity that seemed right and proper. What had begun with his discovery of the saddle beneath dusty blankets had developed into a relationship that transcended ordinary understanding, bringing him insights from another life while helping him discover his own path. I think I finally understand what you've been telling me all along, Ellis said softly to the saddle. It's not about the journey or the destination. It's about how fully you're present for each step along the way. Outside the stable, twilight was settling over Dust Creek, transforming the ordinary buildings and dusty street into something more graceful and mysterious. Ellis could hear distant sounds of the small town preparing for evening, the closing of the general store's door, children being called home for supper, the last metallic ring from Micah's forge being extinguished for the day. Within these humble surroundings, Ellis had found something he hadn't even known he was seeking, not merely employment or shelter, but a way of being in the world that honored both its challenges and its simple joys. Through Caleb's memories, preserved somehow in the well-worn leather of his saddle, Ellis had glimpsed a life lived with integrity and presence, values he now sought to embody in his own way, in his own time. He reached out one last time, his fingertips tracing the intricate tooling along the saddle's skirt, the running horses, the distant mountains, the lone rider silhouetted against the sunset. The continuous circular narrative that had no beginning or end seemed particularly appropriate now, embodying as it did the ongoing nature of experience passed from one life to another, one generation to the next. "Thank you," Ellis whispered, his voice barely audible even in the quiet stable, "for sharing his story, and for helping me find my own." As darkness settled completely around him, Ellis rose and made his way toward the stable door, pausing briefly to check on old Bess, who nickered softly in recognition. Tomorrow would bring another day of ordinary work, feeding horses, cleaning stalls, mending tack. Yet Ellis found himself looking forward to these tasks with genuine anticipation. Within such ordinary moments, he had discovered, lay opportunities for the same mindful presence that had characterized Caleb's life, the same potential for finding meaning in careful attention to what was directly before him. Outside, the first stars had appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. Ellis paused in the stable doorway, looking up at their distant light with new appreciation. Somewhere in that vastness, he thought, Caleb Winters might be riding still, not as a ghost or spirit in the conventional sense, but as a pattern of being, a way of moving through the world with attention and respect. That continued through those who recognized its value. With this comforting thought, Ellis closed the stable door behind him and walked toward his small room, already planning to return the following evening to sit once more beside the whispering saddle. Not because he needed more stories or guidance, but because some conversations, once begun, deserve to continue for as long as possible. Like good trails that lead always toward home, no matter how far they might wander in between. And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the west be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight.